It's Christmas. It's that time of year when we remember the birth of a child. But not just any child. J.I. Packer, evangelical scholar, he reflects on how many of us have troubles with the Easter story. Because we ask the question, how could the death of one man deal with the sins of the whole of humanity? What Packer does is he points out that the problems that we might have with the Easter story actually are rooted in questions about the Christmas story. He suggests that once we realise who was being born in the Christmas story, the question of the value of his death largely gets resolved. Our Gospel for today are the first 14 verses of the prologue of John's Gospel. The prologue is John chapter 1 verses 1 through to 18. There are no ancient texts of John's Gospel, no ancient manuscripts which don't have the prologue. The prologue is always present. It sets the scene for what's to follow in the rest of the Gospel, and I want to suggest that it's the high water mark of Christian theology. So let's hear it. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world through him came into being, yet the world did not know him. He came to that which was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood, or of the will of the flesh, or of human will, but of God. And the Word became flesh, and lived among us, and we have seen his glory. The glory as of the only Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. The word in the Greek is the word logos, and the cultures into which John is speaking all had a kind of common and shared understanding of what it meant. They all had their own take, yet there was a unity and a understanding of what it really was. And we see here that the Logos, the Word, is God in action. You have lots of ideas? I do. Always buzzing with them. But what happens to them? Nothing, unless they're given expression or unless they're enacted in some way. Without being expressed or put into action in some way, they remain just ideas, maybe dreams, fantasies, to be forgotten in the midst of time. I've been helped by Darrell Johnson, a Presbyterian Canadian preacher and scholar. He simply refers to the Logos as the divine expression. Okay, that's how the divine expresses itself. So let's just take that for a moment and go back to the opening chapters of Genesis. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. When God speaks, stuff happens. This is no longer then just an idea, a dream, a fantasy, a mental plan. It has now been expressed, and in the expression, enacted. For with God, that's all that's required. God says it, and it's so. The Word, the Logos, the agent of expression of God's intent, is God at work, God active in creation. Without the Logos, there is no creation. Without the Logos, there is no universe of any kind, multi or otherwise. Without the Logos, there is no life. Let's notice some things then about what John says about this Logos in the first 4 verses of this prologue. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. For God to be God, the Logos was always part of Godness. Nothing that was, is, or will be happens without the activity of the Logos. I want us to notice too that life was inherent in the Logos. All life is derivative from the life of the Logos. The Logos is the source of all life, and that life is shared. We have the miracle of life happening billions of times every day, and we largely fail to notice. The miracle of human conception fails to amaze us. That divine spark of life, where a new life form is initiated, happens countless times every day, and we barely notice. Verse 9 we read, the true light, this divine spark, this same Logos, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. It's a bit ambiguous, this text. Actually, I've noticed that John does that quite a bit in his Gospel. It can be read in 2 ways, and nearly always both things are true. So as we saw here in the New Revised Standard Version, the true light was coming into the world, referring to the incarnation, referring to the birth, referring to the advent. But it's also, as we read it in the King James Version, that was the true light, which lighteth everyone that cometh into the world. Both are true. The Word, the Logos, was coming into the world and is the source of life of everyone coming into the world. This Logos is the source of all life, yours and mine. As Colossians 1 reminds us, it's in him that all things consist, or all things hold together. Or Acts 17 reminds us, in him we all live and move and have our being. The reality for each of us is that our next heartbeat is dependent on him. Every cell in our body and interacting with every other cell, every part of us is held together by the Logos. And here's the thing that Christmas reminds us of, this amazing truth. The Word, this Logos, became flesh and lived among us. In some mysterious and incomprehensible way, he laid aside all authority and power and joined us as one of us, took on corruptible human form and lived among us. The word literally is translated tabernacled, which means pitched his tent. He pitched his tent among us. And what this does is it emphasizes the fragility, the vulnerability that we all experience and which he has submitted himself to and joined. But then verse 14 goes on to say this, and we have seen his glory. The glory is of the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. Glory has a number of ways of being understood. The first thing that we so often think of is of brilliance, of brightness. But it also has a sense of weight, of substance, that which leaves an indelible impression on the beholder. And it also has a sense of essence, of what and who this really is. And this is what we have here. In Jesus we see the essence of God, of what God is really like, who God really is. God is Christ-like. God is like Jesus. The last verse of the prologue, verse 18, reads, "No one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known." When we see Jesus, we see God. We see what God is really like. We are confronted with this Christ-like God. We see what God is willing to do to demonstrate his commitment to his creation, to us. Willing to divest himself, lay aside the power and authority that are his, and join us to pitch his tent among us. And this is what the Christmas story is all about. Jesus coming, starting, conceived in the womb of Mary as a single cell, risking birth, born in a stable in dangerous and unpredictable times, in a politically unstable part of the then known world, born to an unmarried mum who was far from home, her only visible support a man she barely knew. Wow. And it's this that we celebrate today. This is what God was willing to do for you and for me. Join us, pitched his tent among us, becomes one of us, lives as we do with all the struggles, with all the tensions, with all the vicissitudes of life, because he's committed to us. God with us, Emmanuel. So as you head off into Christmas today, know of God's love and commitment to you. God bless you and yours. And may the assurance of God's love and commitment to you be yours this day. Amen.